So I'd like to now welcome my next guest, who I believe is in studio, Sharon Steele. Thank you for coming in.
Hello.
You've been here before.
I have.
Yes, and I said come back in and we've got more things to talk about, and it looks like you've got more things to talk about.
You ask and you shall receive.
Well, I call you the community activist, former head of the Julia District Association, basically the right-hand man with Arthur right now, focusing on all things 195, which we'll get to in a little bit.
Okay.
But also very focused on what's happening at the Board of Licenses, and we want to let folks know here today.
We do.
Big shakeup this week. Obviously, they were trying to push forth a new license administrator who got shot down.
To replace Serena.
To replace the existing license administrator. It'll be interesting to see moving forward how quickly they move to put forth somebody else. Have you heard anything on that front?
Honestly, no. And my hope is that it doesn't, in fact, move forward quickly, because I think it's time to regroup, because apparently they didn't take the, shall we say, the job requirements seriously. Because had they taken them seriously, obviously the candidate would not have been allowed to apply.
Okay, so we're keeping eyes on that, but one of the things you wanted to talk about was specifically what was approved in the ordinance and what's not being addressed that was approved in the ordinance. And you've got the laundry list of items here that you want to bring to folks' attention. Again, this is at the Providence Board of Licenses, the recent ordinance that has a number of provisions that you say have not been enacted, and you want to go through
quickly, because
okay.
I know you want to do this quickly.
No, I want folks to know what's going on with the Board of Licenses and what you see as a community activist that needs to be done.
Okay, so Arthur Salisbury and I have been going to these meetings 3 times a week for about the last 3 years, but who's counting? So we are trying very, very hard to, shall we say, get the existing commissioners to follow the ordinances and to adhere to the legislation that we worked very, very, very hard to pass in the legislature. So the legislation had all very specific things, like the chair of the committee needed to have a law license.
Mm-hmm.
I could go on and on, but that one just sort of jumps right out. But in any event, that legislation became effective upon passage, which was July of 2016. I think it was the 9th, but it was the beginning of July. Has anything happened with that? Absolutely not, okay?
And you've got the full list here of things that you want to say have not happened yet.
I didn't actually take that list because it's longer than this list.
Okay.
But this is the list of the ordinances. And there were basically 7. And this was passed February of this year. However, we had talked about all of this literally for the whole year.
So this is none of these came as a surprise.
New news. Exactly. So I'm just going to go very quickly down the list so we can talk about sort of
Each one.
Okay. Okay, so the first one is that they finally defined the role of the license administrator, and basically said we needed to have one, and well, they tried, but we don't have one, and we are still waiting. That was number 1. Number 2, they indicated that we should have a pre-hearing officer.
Yes.
This would be instead of the attorneys having meetings in the corridor and sort of agreeing on certain things, and then bringing it back in the room, and they would then come as recommendations by the commissioners at the request of the assistant city solicitor.
Now, this is for a few things, correct? To have a little bit more transparency about how this happens.
There you go.
And then when you go to the actual meeting to have things sort of smoothed out and hammered out. I've been covering them, and you see the back and forths that go on. So again, this is having particularly a pre-hearing officer.
Right.
And that's a position.
That's a position.
That needs
so they
to be
created the position, and so now we need to fill it.
Okay.
So the answer is that is not yet filled. Then they said that we needed an information technology specialist, not just one for City Hall or for the various and sundry agencies.
Specifically for the Board of Licenses.
This was specific for the Board of Licenses. So once again, that person doesn't exist, has not yet been hired. Then the proceedings of the Board of Licenses, which are recorded, okay, they're supposed to be posted, very specifically and correctly in something that's referred to as the portal. So the Secretary of State has it. You're familiar with this.
I'm very familiar with
It's all about public rights.
Yes.
And that you must announce them 48 hours in advance. They must be correct. If they're not correct, then obviously they are not duly announced, and you know how that goes. So anyway, that is still not working properly. Okay, the whole concept of that.
And they get an information technology specialist.
That is precisely the person who would help in this specific situation.
For the proceedings.
For the proceedings, exactly. Now, in addition to that, there continue to be errors on the agendas, okay? So therefore, one of the things that the commissioners have to do is basically correct the agenda before they can even literally undertake whatever that item is on the agenda.
Yes.
And that continues to happen with, let's just say, a fair degree of regularity. Okay, required training, number 5, of board members and staff. Now, we have a new commissioner this year, and I would say to you, I have heard that he has had about an hour of training. Now, I would say that defies or clearly prevents anyone from being able to fulfill their responsibilities on the Board of Licenses, because it is a fairly complex situation.
Yes, it is.
So this requires really, really top shelf people who are who have experience, business experience, administrative experience, life experience.
From the chair's perspective, legal experience.
From the chair's perspective, we're waiting for the legal experience, but we don't have that yet. So in any event, that hasn't happened. And then remember that legislation that was passed in July? There has been little to no training on that legislation. So for instance, one of the new licenses that was put in place is something called the Supper Club license. Well, that had to be advertised 3 times before you could even do anything. There had to be lots of training. None of that has happened, okay? So we spent a lot of time in calendar year 2016 literally writing and fine-tuning that legislation, but in fact, it's still sitting there and nobody is really using it. So then we go to 6, which is the annual report. Okay, so the chair filed his annual report this year, a tad late, but let's just say that it was light on facts. It did not comply with any of the ordinances, which in fact it needed to speak to, because that was one of the most important things that was supposed to be enacted literally in calendar year 2016.
So it's supposed to be sort of the report card, if you will, of how they acted on the ordinances.
The report card. You know, it was supposed to contain things like the monthly report, which showed how many outstanding fines there were, et cetera, et cetera. Now remember, there have been audits, but there was another audit, literally, which was, shall we say, agreed to by the administration. And about 6 weeks ago, I think, maybe a little bit longer, Blum Shapiro was actually hired to do yet another audit of the administrator's department. And I do not know the date that is due, but we are very much looking forward to seeing what that audit says.
We've had the Jeff Pine report. We're having the Blum Shapiro report.
And we've had many reports before that. Okay, but the bottom line is that if the personnel doesn't change, then it is not likely that there will be any adherence to either the ordinances or to the legislation, because it's not something that you can expect. Okay, and last but not least, you've been there for some of these, so you will be able to speak to this. This one is about decorum and professional conduct. Now, we both know that there are lots of attorneys who present before the Board of Licenses, and let's just say that some of them are rather passionate about what it is that they are doing, and sometimes there's a bit of grandstanding, let's just say, that happens, and that the chair doesn't necessarily have total control. So I would say they're probably working on that, but we have a long way to go in that arena. And this is an administrative hearing. And so it probably should more resemble what we see in a courtroom than what we see in a different kind of a room, and I'll just leave that to people's imagination. Okay, and the other thing is that there's something called Robert's Rules of Order, and at the Board of Licenses, this is commonly used in committees, not-for-profit boards, all over the place. Let's just say that not everyone is quite familiar with the way that works, and one would hope that by this time they would be. So that's just sort of a quick overview of that, and I think perhaps everyone should take a deep breath and caucus and think about really what we need to have in that administrator's office to do the really, really important work that needs to be done.
So you're there, you know, as you said, practically every meeting, if not every single meeting, and you've got the ordinances and you've got the notes here. You know, it's interesting. We had the piece yesterday about the fallout from the license administrator. The director of administration resigned.
Right.
There was allegations of connections to the person who was being nominated. There was a lot of feedback, especially I saw on social media, to the average person who doesn't go to the Board of Licenses meeting. They kind of maybe tossed their hands up and said, well, what did you expect at City Hall? What did you expect at Providence? What do you have to say to folks who might not be the folks, you know, who might not even be applying for a license, but why should this matter to the average Providence resident?
It should matter for this reason, okay? Because quality of life in our neighborhoods and in our communities can only happen if there is strict adherence to all those rules and regulations that are controlled and administered by the Board of Licenses. So if in fact we want a vibrant economy, okay, that vibrant economy and quality of life are mutually exclusive. If in fact we continue to have a small number of clubs reign, let's just say, a bit of terror on the neighborhoods. We have had stabbings, we have had shootings. This continues to happen with way more regularity than it should. And it really is something that every neighborhood needs to care about, especially neighborhoods that are mixed-use neighborhoods where restaurants and retail and offices and residences have to coexist.
And we just saw this happen down on Wickenden Street.
We certainly did.
Do you want to explain to viewers a little bit about this recent example?
Well, let's see. On Wickenden Street, the Fox Point neighborhood came together, and there was a new restaurant that was applying for a license, and they were applying for what's called a BX, or a 2 a.m. closure.
In the location of the former Z-Bar, correct?
Correct. So at the corner of Brook and Wickenden. And as a result of a very active neighborhood, and the Fox Point Association is just like the Jewelry District Association or the Federal Hill Association or the College Hill Association, and what we're there to do is literally look out for our members and to create an environment where we can have both quality of life and a vibrant economy. And so in this particular situation, the neighbors came together. And even though the petitioner had withdrawn the request for the 2 a.m. license and said, we'll take the 1 a.m. license, in fact, what was decided after half dozen or 8 neighbors got up and spoke is that the closing time, in fact, was restricted to 12 midnight. And the patio, the outside space, was restricted to 11 p.m. So this is what grassroots effort is all about. And it simply means that you live in that neighborhood. If you care about what happens there, you really, really, you have to do the things, when you think about what we did at the stadium, which was what? Show up, speak up, stay involved. And if everyone does that, it's going to be a better place for everybody.
And as I said, you know, give you the label of community activist because you are everywhere, it seems, with things that are going on here in the city. And I know you want to talk about sort of 2 subject areas today. The first being the Board of Licenses, which we talk about extensively. The second being 195.
Correct.
And the development that happened this week with the new Senate President. Talk a little bit about that and what your position is on it.
Okay, so the Senate President, Dominic Ruggiero, came out, was interviewed, and he was rather specific about saying that he wanted to literally change the makeup of the I-195 Commission, and do something that, quite frankly, if you had a primer in separation of powers, you would realize that that is not something that is within the control of the Senate President, okay? That is not something that he can do. And John Marion at Common Cause, I am quite sure, would be happy to do a primer on separation of powers. Because in 2004, we actually amended the Constitution, and we made it very clear what the executive branch versus the legislative branches can actually do.
And the 195 Commission is in the purview of the executive branch.
Absolutely, positively. And hot off the press, I just heard that Dominic Ruggiero was having a visit at the State House by none other than the president and owner of the Paw Sox, Larry Lucchino. And they are having a get acquainted meeting. And so all I want you all to remember.
Does that tingle your spidey senses?
Does that ring sort of a common chord with people? So, just when you think it's over, maybe it's not quite over.
And the finance chair, Dan DuPont, was removed.
I heard that.
Yes.
I heard that.
And, major shakeups. We had folks in to break down the new power structure up at the General Assembly. And there was a lot of thoughts that it might continue to be not too much of a differentiation between the pie of a weed Senate, but it looks like there's been a lot of shakeups in the past few days.
Right. And, I must say, as a business person and someone who has, been in the community and doing business for darn near 40 years, though don't pass that along. It is very disturbing to hear when those kinds of things happen, and when people like our Senate President say those kinds of things, because frankly, a lot of people believe it. And the reality is that what he suggested for the I-195 Commission simply is not a possibility.
Is there any possibility for a revisit by the ownership of the Paw Sox at 195?
At 195, I would say hell no if that's allowed.
You can say whatever you want.
But I would say no. But last I heard, they were looking at several sites in Pawtucket.
Yes, the Apex site. They had that big report about whether or not to leave McCoy and rehab it, tear down McCoy, but it was, again, only at that location.
Right.
We had Mayor Grabian in here. Everyone's keeping close tabs on the Paw Sox as to, just for recent history and for all the things that came along with it and your involvement with that effort.
And if people want to sort of read, God knows Google's public financing of stadiums, and there is a plethora of articles that you can read. It probably doesn't make a lot of sense to spend our money that way.
Well, Sharon Steele, community activist, Board of Licenses gadfly, 195 Commission gadfly, always coming in here, and I do appreciate it, letting folks know, keeping tabs on what's going on here in the city. And as I asked you, why it makes a difference to Providence residents to keep tabs on what's happening with the Board of Licenses. And as you went through, holding them accountable for these ordinances, and I'm assuming you'll continue to do so. Maybe have a little scorecard on maybe like a website somewhere. And
maybe so, but the scorecard that we really should pay attention to is the amazing, amazing difference that the new companies are going to make coming into the I-195 corridor. That is truly the game changer that Rhode Island needs. And those people could have chosen to be in lots of other places. So I think we are going to do it. This place is going to be the new Providence.
Okay, the new Providence. And of course, we'll have Sharon Steele come to talk about everything. Oh, as always, Sharon, appreciate your coming in today.
Thank you, Kate.
Thank you.
Have a great one.
Sharon Steele,
okay.
Community activist, Jewelry District Association, always at the Board of Licenses. Went through the ordinances that she said, again, had passed that have not yet been enacted. Keeping tabs there at that body. And also talked about 195 with the new Senate President's comments about looking into the makeup of the commission and oversight of such, and again, pointing out that the purview of the commission is an executive function, not one of the legislative branch.